So what I'm going to do tonight is give touch on some of the chapters in the book. It's about 290 pages and about 20 chapters, so I'm just going to be touching on a few of the things that are in that. And Val brought up one of the ladies that I always talk to was Amanda, who lived over in Kennedy's Valley, who lived almost to be 100. And she was one of the people that, she was like a third grandmother to me. So this painting was done by my brother, Randy, and it's one of the Clouse homes. It's not my ancestor, but it was one of the Clouse homes. As a boy, I tagged along with my grandfather, who we called Pap or Pappy, and his brother and friends on car trips into the valley. And it wasn't until later that I really began to grasp that these were my ancestors who had lived there for a long time. And after his death in 1973, I figured out that the stories should be written down. So I gathered my notes that I had taken and began writing more. And of course, questions arose, and I started talking with other relatives and former neighbors. And I shared my writing with local historians Pete Bauer near Blaine and Paul Harvey near Newville, who encouraged me to continue. Then later in 1993, I decided that I would do my master's thesis on the stories of the valley. And by the 1990s, all of my informants who were of my grandfather's generation had passed away pretty much. But I continued to do research of court documents, collect photos, and newspaper accounts. And finally I decided after I retired, it was time to get these stories in print. Here's a map of the valley. This was based upon what my grandfather and his brothers told me. This was a road from Newville. Well, it's called Blaine-McCrae Road, but Newville eventually is down here and crossed into the valley. This was the main valley road that went east and west to Landisburg, and then the valley curved around with switchbacks over to Blaine, which was in this area. And this map shows more details of Henry's Valley, which was a long, narrow valley, which led into Schaefer's Valley, into Landisburg, and Dublin Gap, into McCrae, into Newville. And here's Kennedy's Valley, and Landisburg, and Blaine. So the valley had no stores or post office, and so they had to go to either Newville, which they walked, or by horse, or to Blaine to get groceries for the necessities that they needed. This shows John Henry's, who was the founder of the valley, shows his tombstone out in Ohio. He was a Revolutionary War soldier, and you can see the flag there depicting that. And on this side you see John Henry's mill. There was a road docket which I found at the archives here in Cumberland County. Barbara Bartos is here. She helped me find items like that. So evidently it was a log mill, because that's what is drawn on the map. And these are the early settlers. John Henry's son was Christian Henry, and his wife was Catherine Lay. And this is his tombstone in the Pioneer Cemetery. Other early settlers were John and Julianne Shadow Neidig. He died about 1840, very young. He left a widow and 5 children. And she raised the children and made a living for the family at the western end of the valley. And as you can see from the tombstone, she was much loved. by her friends and relatives. This is other early settlers, John Clouse and his wife Margaret Neidig, and these are my ancestors. His brother was Jacob Clouse, and his wife Hannah Kessler. She was from the New Germantown area, Perry County. From the beginning, farmers grazed their cattle, sheep, and hogs on the prairie-like ridges and flatlands of western Henry's Valley during the summer months. And this area became known as the Cowpens because that's where they would round them up in the fall, and there was like a roundup area, and they also took salt there because the cattle needed to be salted every so often. The valley's people made their earnings from timber products such as sawn lumber, fence posts, rails, hoop poles, and peeled bark. And these were their cash crops. Like wheat was a cash crop for the main valley of Cumberland. Cash crop back there was timber products. Except for the bottom fields along the Laurel Run, the soil was thin, so they had to use cow dung and lime to raise their wheat, rye, oats, and corn, which was mainly for the family's use. Things changed in 1843 when Isaiah Graham McFarland established the Des Moines Tannery at the site of the Henry's grist mill, and it became one of the largest tanneries in Perry County. And of course, that brought in skilled and unskilled laborers and necessitated improved roads into the valley from Newville, Blaine, and Landisburg. And that, of course, helped historians like me because with the improved roads, you got more information about the people that lived there. The tannery reached its highest production during the Civil War era and closed in the early 1800s, or early 1880s, due to railroad connections and the technological changes in the industry. And in the 1860s also, the All Brothers established a large steam-powered sawmill in western Henry's Valley, which expanded the road networks back there as well. In the 1890s, during my grandfather's time, there was large-scale timbering, which gave a lot of work for the people in the valley and neighboring valleys, starting of the Newport and Sherman's Valley Railroad. This is a site plan of the Des Moines Tannery. This is the main complex right here, where the vats were. They of course had to take the hair off the hides, and that was the main building there. There were bark sheds here. This was Henry's original grist mill site and the sawmill site, which continued while the tannery was still in operation. Down here's the office and the cookhouse. And these were some of the housing for the workers. There was also a couple houses on this side of the road too. This is the site of the vats. You can see here where there's still water in that area. A few of the foundation walls. This is the site of the office, the site of the cookhouse and the large chimney. You can see here. These are tanner's slickers. They were used by Henry Boblitz, who was one of the supervisors at the tannery. And I found out about them and purchased them. But they were, as the tanning process progressed, they used different slicker to smooth the hide. That's what I've learned about that. These were some of the tanners in the valley. John Bittner and his wife Hannah, and John Henry and his wife Mary Bittner. This is where the bark grinder sat, and people with metal detectors found these shafts in 1983, and I have photos of them. In 1812, John Henry provided for a parcel of ground for the school and burial purposes. But prior to 1850, most of the residents attended communion services and had their children baptized at Lutheran churches either near Newville or at Blaine. In 1860, however, the group got together and organized the Henry's Valley Church, holding its services in the schoolhouse there. However, too, the valley was never large enough to build its own church building. And from the 1860s on at least into the 1880s, the congregation had supply pastors from Blaine, Louisville, Newville, and Blazerville. Ascension Day was a particularly well-celebrated occasion for the people there. It's known as 40 days after Easter is when it's celebrated. And it was important because at that time, the people got together and cleaned and decorated the graves of their ancestors there. And then they would have a service in the schoolhouse afterwards. And it was a small one-story log building covered with German siding and stood on a sandstone foundation just south of the cemetery. And it was called Cold Spring, naturally after the cold spring that was located there where they got their water when school was in session. In the 1890s, the records show that the school averaged about 25 students per term, which was about normal for this area. However, after the state began buying up the land in 1906, the population dwindled, and by 1913, school was closed. The state forester who lived across the road from the school took the schoolmaster's desk, and in 1924 it was sold at his sale. This is a photo of the school. You can see, well, you can't really see because of the black and white photo, but it was painted red with white trim and had a central chimney for the stove, which was in the middle of the schoolhouse. So they tried to make it as nice as they could from the exterior, but it was still a log building inside. This is the cemetery, which was up the slope from the school. You can see this was a large white oak tree. There's part of a stone wall along here. This are the first and last marked graves in the cemetery. The first marked grave wasn't until 1855. However, there were people buried there long before that. This is the last marked gravestone. This was a Ascension Day gathering at the cemetery. You can see how they heaped up ground over the graves and put flowers on. Most of the people here are Clouse descendants, the ones that I can recognize. This was my great-grandfather, whose parents and grandparents are buried here. Although his parents have marked graves, his grandparents have unmarked graves there. Many were just marked with mountain stones. This is a group picture. This was Mark Bauer, the teacher, who looks almost as young as some of the students. My grandfather wasn't on the picture, probably because he was playing hooky, I don't know, or picture taken. This is the schoolmaster's desk. The Civil War had a great effect on the people there in the valley. Two men, William Clouse and Daniel Stone, would not return. Many of you probably know that 2/3 of the war deaths at that time were from disease rather than from actual bullet wounds or wounding in any sense. I have William Henry's letters, and they provide insight into camp life and the soldiers' concerns for back home. And I think from reading the letters, you get the sense that he knew he would never come back to see his loved ones again. And as in all wars, it was a terrible loss in lost lives and safety wounds. The letters also show that the soldiers traveled by railroad and steam to ports in the Carolinas, Florida, and Louisiana, places they would not have otherwise experienced. And of course, the war also meant greater demand for leather, and so the tannery in the valley was quite busy. And during the 1862 and 64 invasions of the valley by the rebels, cattle and horses were hidden at the cowpens and at other locations in the valley. And that's when the cowpens really became more well known, is because the Civil War brought that out. And in summer of 1863, communications by rail and telegraph through the Cumberland Valley was cut off by the rebels, and the highways were guarded by troops. So that's why at Chambersburg they knew there were troops already there, and Ben Huber was one of the people who rode from Chambersburg through the valley and on to Newport and took the train to Harrisburg to let the people know, the officials there, that there was the impending battle of Gettysburg. We see that southern Perry County was at the northern border of the war at the time. And of course there was great division locally too. You see this in the newspaper accounts of what was going on at the time. And the election of 1864 was hotly contested, and David Easterline was killed by David Grove in Landisburg. However, he was not found guilty of manslaughter. This shows a tent for it held 5 men, so you can see how easily it would have been to pass diseases from one person to another. This is my great-grandfather's brother, William Henry Clouse, or cousin rather. He was the one he died of typhoid. This is one of his letters. It shows stars and stripes and encampment outside the Capitol. It's actually dated 1862. Someone else wrote that.
Yeah.
And this is my great-grandfather's brother, David Clouse, on the left. And this is Bill Miller and his wife, who was in a different regiment. And this is my depiction of the cowpens. There's no photos of it, so from what I was told, there was sort of a pens where they pinned up the cattle when they came in at the roundup. And also this little shanty here was used where they put salt down and feed for the cattle. Like I said, they need to be salted probably once a month so that they didn't become completely wild. And so that was one of the attractions then for them to be able to round them up in the fall. And this is the tombstone of David Easterline, who was killed, as you can see on his tombstone at Landisburg on Election Day in 1864. And a local lady, Mary Egoff, told me that it occurred here at this alcove between this stone house and this in Landisburg. And I also was quite interested, of course, as an architectural historian, in the housing of the valley. And of course, everything, because there was so much timber, log was the prime material that they used. And the early 19th century houses used the 3-room plan, which is, some say, is derived a Germanic plan, but it had a chimney along one gable end, and the other end had the front parlor with a small bedroom to the rear. And in this area of the Perry County, they had a large stone bottle-shaped exterior chimney to service the fireplace. The houses had no formal symmetry. Windows were placed where light was needed most, usually next to doors, or where there was they needed access to see the cows or whatever that was importance of their work. Here's one of those bottle-shaped chimneys. And here you can see that you would think there might be a window here, but there's no, what we call Georgian symmetry to this log house. There's another one with the bottle-shaped chimney along the gable end. And in this case, the logs have been whitewashed. Now there's a little symmetry to this house with the windows above each other. Again, it seems almost like there's a window missing. And in this case, there had been a fire and a shingle roof. The shingles were replaced. And this is the smaller house where the kitchen was in the basement. And they had a parlor and bedroom on this first floor. And on the loft, there was another bedroom. Again, it still had that stone chimney along the end. So now I'm getting to the stories. Of course, they were hard workers, and stories lessened the drudgery of their everyday work. And stories were told at the day's end, relaxing at home, or at a local store over cheese and crackers. And sometimes they were given cider or wine by the storekeeper. Stories were also told when neighbors got together for harvesting, butchering, apple butter boiling, cider making, etc. Those who told me the stories began with my grandfather and his brothers, their neighbors, Amanda and Mary. And then I learned about the mountaineer Lightning brothers, Bowman and Herman. And Pete Bauer of near Blaine had a long-time interest in the valley. And there was Noah Schaefer also, who offered me stories from his perspective. And Edgar Heckman, a native of Dublin Gap, also knew the valley's stories. These people were back and forth from the valleys into the mountains all the time. And of course, as I said previously, these were my grandfather's generation. Those were the ones that I got most of my information from, and they had died by the mid-1990s. Also, I want to point out that they were not only for amusement, but to recount history. As Bill Miller recounted his adventures in the Civil War, others told about their adventures as well, whether they were hunting or whatever. And they were told at dances, religious gatherings, funerals, and then on Ascension Day. And they form generally three categories. The early settlement period and the difficulty in traveling to and from this nearly inaccessible valley, and struggle with the valley's wildlife, including bears, mountain lions, wolves, and snakes. And of course, recounting of the tragic and often mysterious deaths of women and men in the valley. Here's a couple of the storytellers. Bill Miller, sitting on a rocking chair, which was handmade, covered. It had traveled on the back of a guy who owed Bill Miller a debt. And although he said he didn't want it, evidently he liked it because here you see him sitting there. And this is Amanda, who the one I said was almost like a third grandmother to me. And this is my grandfather here. His brother Reuben, who was killed in World War I, and Truman and Albert. And the other storytellers, this is Solly Gutschall, who was famous for his tall tales, and his wife Annie. And this was the mountaineer I talked about, Herman Lightning. Probably one of the oldest and perhaps most tragic stories is the black woman mistakenly killed for a bear. Variations of this story grew over the years, even changing her gender and who the killers were. My research showed that the event took place on John Henry's property in 1800, just 1 year after he had settled there. Court records reveal that John Henry Jr. shot the woman at the direction of his father. It's unknown about his likely trauma and his later life. The court proceedings found that the boy had mistakenly killed a woman, believing her to be a bear, but they were exonerated from guilt. The earliest other written version of the story was told by Ben Bauer in 1963 in his History of Blaine. Hers was actually the first burial at what became the Pioneer Cemetery, albeit marked only with a pile of rocks at the northeast corner. And this is a view showing the white oak, as I pointed out previously. And the stones, there were piles of stones here, which my grandfather said was where she was actually buried. And then these walls were extended later in the late 20th century around here. And this tree has since died due to gypsy moth. This was the 1963 version of the story, where you see a black boy, it's a boy instead of a girl, in the tree, being treed by a hunting dog. And this is of the actual court in the newspaper, the Carlisle Weekly Gazette. Here's John Henry and John Henry Jr. It pronounces them Henny, and I've since learned that Henny was the Pennsylvania Dutch for Henry. I first thought it was a misprint by the printer, but evidently not. And here it says, with the death of a Negro woman, who the son, leaving her at a distance to be a bear. The killing determined a misadventure, that the woman had been crawling on her hands and feet, and therefore without any imputation of gross negligence, had been mistaken by the father for a bear, who desired his son to shoot. And she received a mortal wound of which she immediately expired. So after years of search, I got to the bottom of what had really happened. And here are my conclusions. The valley's hardy settlers faced many obstacles in daily life, and often life was cut short suddenly. Social gatherings of the valley's folk, such as for butchering, commemoration of the dead, or bean soup, provided the backdrop for the telling of stories. The residents' lives revolved around the seasonal pattern of farming, lumbering, and cattle grazing. The stories illustrate the people's lifeways and portray significant events in the valley's history. The folk valued the valley's landscape, naming each ridge, hollow, and homestead. They also prized the valley's trees, bushes, fields, and the wildlife that provided their livelihood. The stories reflect a strong sense of community, kinship, and a fellowship that survived prosperous and lean times. The stories were oral history lessons passed down to succeeding generations. My history provides a more permanent record of their history and has prompted the telling of additional related stories. Since I've published the book, different people have come up to me and told me different versions and also additional information that I didn't know before, which is good to know. This is one of the most scenic spots in the valley, called the Horsehead Rocks, taken during the fall looking west. And this is Camp Nat on 3 Square Hollow Road. So the valley still attracts hunters and fishermen, and this is part of the heritage there now. Because all the log buildings, original log buildings, are all gone.